And as Sarah said, for me and for so many on tonight's call and beyond, the Greater Yellowstone is indeed a very special place. So enjoy.
Okay. Kevin, could you make me host, please? Okay, thank you. Okay, can everybody see that? Good? All right. Well, I'm pleased to be invited here to talk to you a few minutes about the Mountain Ungulate project we initiated, as Kevin talked about. It was a big collaborative project, involved 22 biologists and 5 different graduate students were trained in the operation throughout the 10, 12, 14 years the project was working. A lot of funding agencies, all the wildlife management agencies in the Greater Yellowstone area contributed. Canon was a big corporate contributor, and the Wild Sheep Foundation and the Governor's Big Game License Coalition put money into. It was a big project. It cost a lot of money, and a lot of people invested in it, and we're very appreciative of that. And under the guise of the model of an integrated research program, we didn't focus on just one aspect of bighorn sheep and mountain goat ecology, but we looked at all of these things here in this graphic, because as you can see from the arrows, to understand any one of them, we have to look at some of the other ones as well. So I'm only going to talk a little bit about primarily habitat and disease in the context of big mountain goats. This is the cover of the book that Sarah was talking about at the end of the project. All the authors got together and thought that it would be good to write a book for the public that took sort of all the technical stuff out of the science and provided the ecological insights we learned in a readable format. And what I'm going to focus on is a little bit from chapter 2, historic information, and then the impacts of expanding mountain goat populations. And then Doug will talk about bighorn sheep. So as Kevin said, historically, mountain goats were not found in the Greater Yellowstone area, and they were translocated into the region. And you can see this is pretty heroic stuff here from the 1940s. These are photographs from Montana. Most of the mountain goats that were introduced, at least in Montana in the northern GYA, came from the Rocky Mountain front, and they were packed out on horses and in makeshift panniers and then pulled into the release sites. Here, as you can see, in these 2-wheeled carts, so a pretty interesting effort. These are the sites that mountain goats were introduced. There was 7 sites in the northern GYA in Montana where mountain goats were introduced in the 1940s and the early 1950s. And then 2 sites down in the Palisades where Idaho Fish and Game introduced animals. A total of 170 animals were released during these introduction efforts. So how well did they do? The first thing we did then when we started this work is we aggregated all the agency data to document the colonization of mountain goats in the GYA and their current distribution, and also to estimate the abundance. And so what I have in the next couple slides is just all the data that we could find from all the agencies and on locations of mountain goats that were credible, primarily picked up by biologists on surveys. So this is 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, and currently this is approximately the distribution of mountain goats. So the introduction was successful. Mountain goats have expanded from those introduction sites, not nearly as quickly, given that it's been almost 70 years, 60, 70 years, as some other famous animals that were reintroduced like wolves. But they've certainly expanded, and we estimate that there's somewhere between 2,300 and 2,900 mountain goats in the GYA today. So here is the distribution of bighorn sheep in the GYA. And as Kevin mentioned in his introduction, they're in Wyoming, just east of the border of Yellowstone National Park. There's the largest, most robust population of native bighorn sheep in North America. So this is extremely important population of bighorn sheep. A continuous distribution of sheep from the Montana border all the way down essentially to the North Wind Rivers. Big metapopulation. These animals are all interacting across different spatial scales. Really important. So then the question is, with mountain goats in the GYA, how does that affect bighorn sheep? And here is a picture from a trail camera on the Wyoming border along the Beartooth Plateau at a lick site. And notice the date and time, June 29th at 2 o'clock, June 30th at 9 o'clock in the morning. We see mountain goats in the exact same spot. So mountain goats and bighorn sheep overlap in a GYA where the distributions overlap, and they can use the same resources like this natural salt lick. And from the current distribution of mountain goats, those yellow arrows demonstrate where we expect mountain goats to be moving and colonizing into the future. And you can see there on the here in the Absarokas, we already have individual mountain goat observations all across this area. And of course, it's been quite a hot topic, the expanding populations in the Grand Teton Range as well. So to evaluate the future of mountain goat distributions and abundance, we put in quite a bit of effort to study the seasonal movements and the habitat use patterns of mountain goats to develop habitat models that we could then extrapolate to the whole GYA. We did it in 3 areas. We did it down in the Palisades where there's only mountain goats. We did it up in the northwestern GYA and the northeastern GYA. We used different techniques for different areas. Let's see. So these 2 areas here we started out with, and we did work called occupancy surveys. This is where we don't depend on radio collars. It's just a rigorous sampling program where you go out and you observe on the landscape and you see where you see goats and sheep and where you don't see them. And from that, you can build some models, habitat models. And we did that because we knew it was going to be really hard to get a good sample of mountain goats radio collared, and it was going to take some time, and the agencies wanted information before that. So our radio collar work was in the Palisades, and then over here in northeastern GYA, where we have both sheep and goats. So I'm not going to go into a lot of that. The capture work for radio collaring was really challenging. We did some ground captures down by Alpine along the Snake River Canyon, but most of the work was done with helicopter net guns. And you can see sort of this dramatic photo of a mugger trying to grab and constrain a mountain goat here in this work. So from all that work, I'm not going to talk about the models themselves. I'm just going to show you the extrapolations of what those models, given all that data that from those 3 study areas, suggested was habitat for mountain goats in the GYA. And you can see it's pretty extensive. And we estimate that there's about 11,000 square kilometers of mountain goat habitat. And we can expect mountain goat range expansion. And if all that habitat's occupied at similar densities to the areas in the northern GYA and the Palisades, we'd expect that mountain goat populations, when they fully occupied the GYA, would increase by 2 to 4 times. So 4,000 to 6,000 mountain goats instead of the 2,000 to 3,000 we have today. So there's bighorn sheep distributions, the current distributions. So you can see that if one's worried a little bit about competition between bighorn sheep and mountain goats, it looks like bighorn sheep and mountain goats are going to occupy essentially much of the same range as your core native bighorn herds in Wyoming. Just to zoom in on that Absaroka area that's just now being colonized, here on the left, you can see the habitat model showing predicted mountain goat habitat with warmer colors, meaning better habitat, and the distribution of bighorn sheep in that same area. So certainly if this area gets colonized, it's going to be right on top of bighorn sheep. And the same here you can see for the TETON range. So there's the potential for bighorn sheep and mountain goats to be coexisting throughout the GYA and certainly throughout the core native herds. What's really interesting about the core native herds in Wyoming is that a significant proportion of those animals winter at high elevation. They don't come down to low elevation ranges. And here, if you can't quite see it, these are all pictures that I think Doug took of bighorn sheep on really high elevation. And we think that if there's going to be serious competition that would be deleterious to bighorn sheep, it will be when mountain goats establish on these high elevation winter ranges of bighorn sheep throughout that core native ranges. And so this is something that the agencies need to think about. We know that bighorn sheep and mountain goats can occupy the same areas and coexist. But these are some issues that the agencies have been talking about ever since we generated these data. The other thing I would just want to mention very quickly is disease. We all know the stories of disease and its impacts on bighorn sheep. And so when we were doing all that capture work for mountain goats, we also tested all the mountain goats for the same pathogens that cause pneumonia and respiratory disease in bighorn sheep. And for many of you that have probably been on bighorn sheep captures, you've seen these sort of testing procedures as these photographs show. And what we found was mountain goats, both in the southern GYA and the northern GYA, host all the same respiratory pathogens that cause respiratory disease in bighorn sheep. So that is another finding to help inform the agencies when they decide, as they decide on management plans for both bighorn sheep and goats in the future. And with that, I'd like to pass it on to Doug if Doug's ready.
Yeah, I think so. If you hand me the controls, I'll see if I can get things up and running.
Okay, let me see if I can switch you over. Are you a host now?
I think so.
There? Nope.
I see Doug as the host. So Doug, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay. And I have two. There it is.
Thank you.
That's not coming. Do you see a presentation or just a pack string?
We see a presentation.
Oh, okay, great, great. Because that's not what I'm looking at, but I think I can do this from memory here. So first of all, I'll take up where Bob left off. So looking at the table of contents here in the book, I'm just going to touch on a couple topics. One being, let's see if we can move through it. It's not advancing though. I don't know how that advanced, but it did. Talking about bighorn sheep health and disease, and then moving on to talk about ungulate migration.
You know, Doug, let's just pause and see if we can figure it out real quick, because I think it'll just make it a lot easier on you. What if you go to slideshow, and then custom slideshow?
Yep.
I don't know if that will change the setting. Oh, use presenter view. There we go. So let's X out of that guy. And then see that box a little to your right? It says use presenter view.
Just
Yes.
kind of going over it again, just.
All right.
It gets confusing after a while because we have so many things going through our head.
And I think
There we
it was net
Oh,
about, out of the 14,000, about
Can we
8,600.
just ask anyone who's not presenting to please mute themselves?
Well, as we get, it all becomes proportionate after a while, and
Well, $8,600 is not something.
Ellen Collins, could you please mute?
right. We just don't know the right
Randy,
answer. all the way now.
Randy and Sandy, could you please mute? Doug, because you're host, you have the
Oh.
capability to mute people.
Okay,
Sorry to
let
call
me-
you guys out. Randy, yeah, okay. All right,
All
Doug.
right. So we're going to talk a little bit about bighorn sheep disease and then about migration strategies. So everybody's probably familiar with the overall distribution of bighorn sheep and its tendency through time to become less and less. So this is just looking at west-wide, how that distribution has shrunk. And we'll key in on Wyoming here. This is the west-wide picture. If you look at Wyoming, this is from Ernest Thompson Seton's 1929 book on the lives of game animals. If anybody's not seen that, I suggest you look at it. It's quite an entertaining read of anecdotes, personal observations, interviews. Anyway, that's where a lot of really historic work is based, is in Ernest Thompson Seton's book. So this was his estimate of distribution in the mid-1800s. And from what I've discovered going back through some of his original sources and finding others, I mean, he's pretty spot on. I mean, it's a pretty general map, but it's pretty dang close. I guess I'm kind of impressed. Next is 1942, was a couple researchers named Ralph Honus and Edward Frost. Worked mostly in the Crystal Creek drainage in the Grovont, the Jackson sheep herd, but they also took a look statewide at bighorn sheep distribution. So this would have been in the late 30s, early 40s. Ralph Honus was a parasitologist at UW. Edward Frost, I got to give a shout out to him. His nickname was Chew. From Cody, his father was Ned Frost, who is perhaps one of the most famous outfitters back in the day. Definitely a sheep enthusiast. So the Frost family has a long, long history in the Cody area. But that's 1942. Look at the distribution has shrunk considerably there. We don't have time to talk about this right now, but if you can you see my cursor? Okay, so if you see this little group of sheep right here, those sheep were translocated there. First translocation in Wyoming, 1934. These sheep came from Flat Creek Canyon in Jackson, sponsored by the Sheridan Chamber of Commerce to put them in Paint Rock Canyon, which is why this exists at all there. So maybe for another talk. Estimates back then were about 2,500 sheep. That was the 30s, 40s. Go to 1960 with Helmut Buchner's monograph. Distribution really didn't change that much. Neither did the estimates of bighorn sheep, about 2,000 or so. Then current day, looking at much wider distribution, mainly due to translocations and some population increases. And we feel like we might have 6,000 or more sheep in the state right now. But like Kevin said, like Bob said, the GYA has always been a stronghold of bighorn sheep. It just always has. If you look in all those maps, they're always in the GYA. Bighorn sheep and disease, what are we talking about? Mostly we're talking about respiratory pathogens. That's their Achilles heel, if you will. Bighorn sheep and domestic sheep, there's obviously an issue there. They have a common origin, but they've been long separated, so they have different pathogen communities, different susceptibilities. But this map is a depiction of domestic sheep allotments around the GYA, at least at one point in time. So it's likely that all bighorn sheep in the GYA were exposed to domestic sheep at one time or another. And I'll talk about this briefly. A lot of these allotments have been reshuffled, vacated through some very sensitive negotiations with domestic sheep producers to minimize the risk of contact between domestic and wild sheep. But there's another side to this too. So domestic sheep are definitely a situation to look out for, but through moving wild sheep, we have probably created some of our own problems by putting and mixing sheep of unknown disease origins in different places. Definitely a concern, not to minimize the good that was done by translocations. And for the folks around DuBois and know the Whiskey Mountain story, you know, almost 2,000 bighorn sheep were translocated out of Whiskey Mountain, 1,500 plus of those in Wyoming and 400 of them into other states to help with their restoration. So it definitely gave bighorn sheep restoration a shot in the arm, but probably came with some issues as well. And one of the ways we usually find out about these disease events is by finding dead sheep. When people find pickup heads, they have to register those with the Game and Fish. So that's one way we can kind of get a heads up that something might be going on. These three graphs depict the Whiskey Mountain die-off in 1991, a big spike in pickup heads. The Jackson herd in 2001, same thing. The Absarokas is a little more complicated, but you see in the mid-90s a die-off event here, and then again here in 2011 through 2013 caused significant mortality as well. So we know the sheep are dying, but we want to understand why and if there's anything we can do. So we have to do some disease surveillance. Well, we folded in a statewide disease surveillance effort into the GYA effort to kind of combine our forces and gain more understanding. So in that 10-year roughly period between 2011 and 2019, we handled almost 1,000 bighorn sheep in Wyoming. 600 and plus of those were in the GYA in Wyoming. Also handled some mountain goats, as Bob said and described about the pathogen communities of mountain goats. We took nasal swabs, tonsil swabs, took blood, feces for various things. Here you can see some of our wildlife health lab folks with a jaw spreader trying to get into that tonsillar crypt and get a very clean tonsil swab there. So that's how we're getting those pathogen community pictures, is through this sampling. I'll just draw your attention to the Northwest Wyoming chunk here. We're looking at 5 pathogens on this map. They're listed there in this legend. What you'll see, and I'll just describe them, they're not that important, the names. The ones that you see, the LKT positive, that's called a leukotoxin positive. Leukotoxin is like a virulence factor, if you will. It compromises the individual's ability to mount an immune response. So when you see that leukotoxin present, that's not a good thing. So you see that in these colors, the blue, the green, and the purple. And the one in the red is kind of a key component of a lot of die-offs. It's called Mycoplasma ovipneumoniae, referred to as MOV for short. That is present in a lot of die-offs that we see. And you'll notice that everything we're talking about is present in the Absarokas, in Whiskey Mountain, and in Jackson. So how can the Jackson herd is almost at one of its all-time high in the recent past. The Absarokas have suffered a setback, but they're still numbering in the thousands. And Whiskey Mountain is struggling extremely with numbers right now. So how can these communities have the same pathogen complex, but still be performing so differently? And that's a question for additional research we've got going on. There's strain types that fall below these and so forth that make it even more complicated. But I guess the shining light here is the fact that in the Targhee herd, in the Tetons, we've not detected some of these more worrisome bugs. So that's the pathogen picture. Another complicating thing is sinus tumors. That's something we don't know a lot about, but we're trying to learn more. This picture here that shows the normal sinus structure here on the right-hand side of this slide, to me, when you see these sinus tumors, it just fills in these sinus cavities. That's just a perfect breeding ground, if you will, for those bacterial organisms. and it's thought that these sinus tumors may play a role in disease spread, in perpetuation of pneumonia in a herd once it's there. And you might have heard the term test and remove. That's kind of what you're trying to get at, is removing those individuals that are spreading those pathogens through the herd. And I would just advise you, don't have time to get into it in too much detail right now, but if you can tune in, I think it's on April 9th, maybe. Francis Kassir from Idaho Fish and Game, who has a ton of experience dealing with this test and remove operation and the dilemma of trying to recover bighorn sheep from pneumonia, will be presenting. So I urge you to all key in on that. So switching to migration stuff, real briefly, I just thought I'd share a little video clip of releasing a helicopter net gun sheep to show you some of the country these sheep get caught in, give our sample sizes, to get a good understanding of what's going on with these bighorn sheep and mountain goat populations. So you can see he's got a mask on this sheep to calm it down, trying to take the hobbles off. You'll see it thrust its head and throw off the mask. You have to take that off because you don't want it running off with its mask still on. Here he's just telling her calmly to calm down. You see the net right up here in the top of the frame. She's got her 2 radio collars on, and there she goes. And that's some pretty insane terrain to try and catch a sheep in, and there's almost no other way you could do that besides helicopter net gunning. So anyway, a little shot into that. We were on the cusp of working with really new technology, radio collars that are more real-time, transmitting directly to your computer, that you can go and download that information without having to go look at the animal in the field. We started off, however, with store onboard collars that were stored all the information on the collar itself. The collar fell off, you'd have to get into an airplane, go find where that collar was at, go pick it up, plug it into a computer and download it. So I just want to show you an example of this is where this radio collar is setting. And this is Sunlight Game Warden Chris Queen celebrating finding it, which I'd like to tell you that this was all about collecting data, increasing our understanding of bighorn sheep and mountain goats and their conservation and management, and it is, but I'd be lying if I said this wasn't fun, and this didn't provide me and Bob and others with some of the most incredible experiences of our career. And just looking at these photos, these were some epic days. And so it's just a privilege to be able to work managing wildlife for the citizens of Wyoming and doing this kind of work. So migration strategies, this is just a map from the book of all of the different herds around the GYA and some of the movements they exhibit. 3 general strategies: long distance migrants, high elevation non-migrants, and low elevation non-migrants. Kind of what's called the portfolio effect, borrowed from investment strategies that you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You want to have a diverse portfolio. Came from the fisheries world, looking at migrating salmon. They do different things. That gives them some resilience, that if something happens in one part of a drainage, it may not affect all of those animals because they're not all doing the same thing. David Quammen was telling me about tent caterpillars and how they exhibit different foraging behaviors, and that exposes them differentially to predation or disease. And so he called that behavioral or heterogeneity of behavior. So when you have an impact, it only impacts part of the population, and the population as a whole can recover. So that's what we see with these different migration strategies. And I'll just use this one map from the Clark's Fork, which is right on the Montana state line, to highlight some of this heterogeneity of behavior or portfolio effect. You have some animals like this that high elevation non-migrant, staying up high all year round, never leaves. You have some that just go up and down elevationally, but don't move very far. You have some like this. This is one of the longest sheep migrations ever documented. But you have some animals that stay here year round, winter here. Then you have others that leave the same place and the same groups of sheep and make this big circuitous migration to winter at another high elevation place. They're not going to a lower place. They're going to a place just as high as the one they left. So what's that about? Fascinating. And then you have these, animals that basically are living at 4,000 feet in the very bottom of the Clarks Fork Canyon and never leaving it. So anyway, a lot of different behaviors, and we think that provides some resilience for these animals. A picture of this is a migration moving from a high elevation summer range, moving to this place in Sunlight Basin at low elevation winter range. Again, we've already talked about this circuitous migration here, so I'll pass on that. This is the low elevation migration in the Clarks Fork Canyon. These animals live down here year round. They might go up the canyon walls a little bit, but they basically are low elevation non-migrants. You see the radio collar that fell off here that was retrieved that day. The other kind of famous low elevation non-migrant is this group of sheep right here in the Du Bois Badlands. And you all recognize this famous ram here from the Du Bois Badlands. Those sheep are there year round. They do mix with some sheep coming down from Area 5 to the north, out of the southern Absarokas, but this is a non-migratory low elevation group of sheep. The real superstars, and Bob mentioned this, are these animals clear in the headwaters of the Yellowstone, headwaters of the South Fork of the Shoshone. How they can exist in some of these terrain features is beyond me. If you can appreciate where my cursor is, this is nothing but a cornice right here. This is where these sheep live all winter. Same thing. This is the same feature on the edge of the Buffalo Plateau. Ali Kortemanch in her thesis was able to document what people back in the 40s were wondering. All these sheep are remaining up high and they don't migrate. You know, they just thought they lived there all the time. Well, actually, they exhibit what's called a reverse migration, whereas commonly sheep will leave a high elevation summer range that's really green and then migrate down to a low elevation summer range or winter range, and then go back when the snows cease and they can go back up in the summer times and it's green. These guys stay up high all winter long until there comes a time when snow loads in the spring snows are real heavy, they don't blow away. But at that same time, the green up is happening from the bottom. So when springtime comes, these guys go downhill, and that's why it's termed a reverse migration. And if you're interested in that, you should really read Ali's thesis. It really explains this in very, very good detail. And so that's just a little bit about the heterogeneity of behavior. I'll just close this again with kind of a fun thing to accentuate how interesting this was. We tried to catch mountain goats in clover traps. Bob Garrett made these clover traps himself. We packed them in here on horseback. We knew we had goats coming into this site. Every time we went in there to actually try and catch them, we never caught a mountain goat with this technique. All we caught was a Montana State University wildlife professor named Bob Garrett in these clover traps. So anyway, I thank you for your attention, but do just want to highlight the collaborative nature of this project, all the agencies, all the individuals, the students. We trained some amazing young people into being wildlife biologists. It was just one of the most rewarding experiences of my career to be involved with this project and in such an amazing piece of country. So thank you. And if we have any time for questions, I'm sure Bob and I would stand for those. So thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, so let's open it up for Q&A. I ask that if you have a question, just type it in the chat box and we can direct it from there.
I'll make a remark that 37 years ago when Doug McWhirter came from Kansas and volunteered with me above Cody, he doesn't look a day older. What the heck is my story?
I don't know how that happened, Kevin.
Okay,
You had white hair back then, though.
Yeah, I did.
First question here is from Kathy Trainer. Kathy is our former president at the Sheep Center. Kathy asks, what is the disease impact on mountain goats?
I guess I can address that. So it's really difficult for people that mountain goats are hard to observe as much. So we do know that there's a very there's very good documentation of an introduced population of mountain goats in Nevada outside of their native range in the Humboldt range, where it was first documented that they had a pneumonia epizootic and a die-off that was concurrent with bighorn sheep. And the way they found that out was they were focused on bighorn sheep. They recognized the die-off, the pneumonia die-off in bighorn sheep, and soon thereafter they looked and they saw that their mountain goat numbers were much lower than they were the bighorn sheep die-off. The biologists in Nevada went and tested those mountain goats, and it turns out they had the pathogens, and they documented essentially a concurrent disease event with bighorn sheep and mountain goats in the Humboldt range. There's no reason to think that mountain goats are not susceptible to the same bacterial pathogens as bighorn sheep, but we don't have the evidence for catastrophic die-offs directly like we do for bighorn sheep. And it's partly because mountain goats are notoriously hard to monitor, to count. They just live in really tough country. And so one can expect that they're suffering the same consequences as bighorn sheep periodically.
Bob, let me add to that Nevada situation. So when the bighorns started dying, Nevada Department of Wildlife went in and removed all the last surviving bighorns. And they waited a year or two, and they didn't do anything with the mountain goats that were there. And then the next batch of bighorns came from the Catamount mine up in Alberta, and those were fairly naive and hadn't had exposure to anything. So they NDOW put those Catamount sheep from Alberta into the Humboldt, and they proceeded to get whatever pathogen transfer happened from the mountain goats to those bighorn sheep. And so that was really one of the first wake-up calls that we had about the shared pathogen loads.
Yeah, and I think that demonstrates that wildlife biologists need to view both bighorn sheep and mountain goats as being capable of sharing pathogens across the two species. And if you think about them, you think about those pictures I had, those two photographs that I dissolved together of bighorn sheep and mountain goats on the same lick site at the same time, are within hours of each other. And when we were doing some of our work, we saw bighorn sheep actually bedded down with mountain goats. So they are not necessarily antagonistic, and they can be at very close proximity and probably can share pathogens that way.
Thank you. Question 2.
I've got a question, or do you have more, Sarah?
There's 2 more questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Karen Sullivan, our education manager. Where did the goats originate that were moved into the GYA?
The goats in Montana almost all came from the Rocky Mountain front up by the Choteau Augusta area. A lot of them came from a drainage called Deep Creek, where there was the long-term trapping, corral trap operation for mountain goats. I'm not sure where the goats came from that were introduced in the Palisades in Idaho. I think it came from a native herd in western Idaho. Kevin, do you know?
I want to say Snow Peak, up in that Mallard Larkins area, but I'm not sure, Bob.
Yeah.
So much information here. Question 3 from Meredith Taylor Dubois. What's the data on goats occurring in the Wind River Range as shown on the map?
Yeah, so the mountain, and I'm trying to remember the ones on the map, but I'm thinking of the ones I remember personally hearing of and seeing the locations. So we know there were recently there have been goats in the upper green, or a goat in the upper green. There was a goat on near Fremont Peak not that long ago, and then one considerably down into the southern winds too. Whether it could possibly be the same goat or not, hard to say, but we still just have sporadic observations there in the Wind Rivers. Was that Meredith that asked that? Yeah, so Meredith, just sporadic observations so far.
All right, Kevin, you're up with your question.
Well, I was going to ask Doug, as a manager, talk a little bit about some of the hunting season changes to put a little more pressure on mountain goats along the east boundary of Yellowstone. What did the department do? And then over in the Tetons as well.
Right, so mountain goats, as per Wyoming statute, were once in a lifetime license. You drew one and you were done. So we had to get a legislative change to allow that to be loosened, to allow a little more harvest pressure on mountain goats in certain places. Now, we've only done that on the west slope of the Tetons and in the southern Absarokas. In the northern Absarokas, we just kept the once in a lifetime limitation, but just dramatically increased licenses because there were getting to be so many goats there. So we're managing for very low densities of goats where we have those overlap areas. But I need to say too that while we're doing that, it doesn't mean we don't like mountain goats. I mean, mountain goats are a fascinating mountain ungulate. I mean, they're extremely cool. And we do manage for thriving goat populations in the Palisades, the Snake Range, and in the Beartooth Plateau area of Wyoming. So this is not a campaign against mountain goats. It's just one of those tough decisions to make that we are often faced with, where we're leaning on the side of native bighorn sheep populations in specific areas. Steve's got a hand up.
Yeah, if you don't mind, could one of you sort of elaborate a bit on, you showed the map with the prevalence of pneumonia-related bacteria within almost all the herds. Some herds are doing okay, i.e. Jackson, maybe Cody. Some herds certainly aren't with the same mix of bacteria. Whiskey Basin, for example, or Dubois area is doing terribly. So could one of you enlighten everyone on possible other effects? Strains is one that sort of sticks in my mind with, Mycoplasma ovopneumonia maybe having 180 strains in domestic sheep, maybe 80 some in wild sheep, and how all this sort of interacts and plays to affect a herd or not affect a herd. What are our thoughts today?
Yeah, I'll share with you mine, and Bob, Kevin, you can chime in too. To me, and this is why I'm not a disease specialist, is it just seems like we keep drilling down farther and farther and farther, and once we finally think we figure out, oh, it's this bug, well then it's like, no, actually there's like 200 varieties of this bug that you need to figure out too. And then it's like, well, then you need to figure out, does it have a leukotoxin or not? Or so it's extremely complicated. But to get to Steve's question, strain types do play a role in that. There are some that are just more virulent than others and can have population level impacts, and some don't. And I think we're trying to make progress on understanding that, but still have a ways to go.
A comment I would make, Steve, and not to put her on the spot, but on the participant list, I saw Dr. Kate Hybert from Washington State University is watching tonight. And for those of you who don't know Kate or of Kate, about the first of this calendar year, she assumed the Rocky Crate Chair, Wildlife Disease Research Chair position at WSU in Pullman. And, with Dr. Shree, he was there for a decade. Dr. Besser, still there, but he's retired, emeritus status. And now Dr. Hybert, there's a lot of focus on chasing the bugs. And what we really wanted to try to move from is, okay, we know what the bugs are, but like Doug said, drilling deeper and deeper and you know, refining that, we want to know what to do once the bugs are in the system on the landscape. That's really what the rubber hits the road in terms of future management. So I'm not going to put her on the spot, but that's one of the things Dr. Hybert is going to try to focus on in her upcoming tenure there at Wazoo.
And I guess I could just make a comment about the strain types. We're getting a really good lesson on strain types with COVID in human populations. And I think that the perception is maybe there are some strains that are more virulent and cause disease, and other ones maybe not so much. And if we identify the strain types, we could figure out which of the pathogen types are harming our bighorn sheep or have the most harm. But the other way to look at it is, if most of the native herds of bighorn sheep have interacted with domestic sheep for over a century, that a bunch of strain types have been circulating around, and a lot of natural selection has probably occurred because of that. So you might have the same strain in the Absarokas that's been around for 100 years that the natural selection has allowed the animals to learn to live with. Doesn't mean they're not, it doesn't cause disease now and then, but it's not catastrophic. But that same strain type taken to a naive herd in Idaho or Nevada could cause quite a bit of epizootic effects. And so strain types are interacting with the history, most likely, of how long those strains have been circulating and how well the populations in given areas have been exposed to them. So as Doug said and Kevin said, is, you know, the deeper we go into this, the more complex it gets. And there's a lot of strains out there, and different strains might have different impacts on different herds, just like COVID, different strains of COVID.
Here's an announcement.
It's
Go
a
ahead.
very, but I will say, it's what you said, Kevin, is really important, because 10 years ago, the idea was if a herd had the bugs, they were diseased and they were toast. And what we've learned over the last 10 years is that almost all the herds have some of the respiratory pathogens associated with pneumonia. Some are doing well, some aren't. Some are never doing well, it seems like, and are on a projected downhill. And some just have sporadic disease outbreaks. And why we see so much variability among the bighorn herds, many of which have the full complement of bacterial pathogens, it's probably that interaction between the environment, the pathogens that are hosted, and the physiology and the robustness of the individual sheep. It's called the epidemiological triad. And that makes it really complicated for us wildlife biologists to figure it out.
You know, Doug hit on it and mentioned
we do know that a whole lot of bighorn sheep carry all the pathogens and they're doing well. And the trick is to figure out why some do and some don't. And, you know, we've been working at it for decades and we got a long ways to go, unfortunately.
Yeah, Doug hit on it, and it's always a tongue-in-cheek analogy that I draw. We've all taken our kids and grandkids to daycare. So you put 10 or 12 or 20 kids in a room, and then at the end of the day, you wonder, well, how come Johnny or Susie's sniffling? Well, you know, so I look at Hell's Canyon, for example, and, you know, it's been a long focal area for bighorn management and research, but you know, I think there's been at least a dozen different source populations of bighorns that have been released into Hell's Canyon, which is a very linear north-south canyon between Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, and a lot of movement. And so, you know, if you put all those in there from 12 different sources and hit the blend key, of course, they're going to swap snot and boogers and whatever they're spewing. with each other. It's just inevitable. And that's not a criticism of our predecessors. They did the best they could in the 40s, 50s, 60s when we were transplanting sheep all over, like Doug said. But it's just something that we've learned, maybe not to do quite so liberally, and be real selective and make sure you know your pathogen profile of your source population as well as your target population.
I have a quick question for Kate. Could you tell the audience where we're at relative to kind of the state of the art in separating and determining strains? I know here in Wyoming, Hank Edwards and Sam Allen and those people are fabulous, but I don't think we're separating strains in Wyoming yet. So what's the state of the art across the West? Put Kate on the spot as a new employee.
Yeah. I saw that Tom Besser was on here earlier, but I'm not sure if he ducked out. He could probably speak a little bit more in depth about strain typing, but for sure, Waddle and some others do some strain typing, but the big source of the strain type database is Washington Animal Disease Diagnostic Lab here on WSU's campus. And, you know, that's well developed. Folks can send their samples in and get them strain typed. And then we could probably talk for a really long time about what those strain types mean, how they're connected to each other, what it means for disease. That's maybe a quick way of addressing your question, Steve. I think it's a deep question that we could talk
Steve,
a lot about.
If I could, and this is just because I had a call this morning with a professor at the University of Guelph in Ontario by the name of Graziele Maboni. She's a geneticist there, and she and Tom and others are collaborating on this next generation sequencing of strain types. And so it's a project that we're helping to fund. And so we just had to do some paperwork and business this morning, but you know, it's that deeper dive, as Doug described it, into this next generation of sequencing, strain typing. And so, but we still need to focus on what do we do now that the bugs are in the landscape? What do we do?
What's it mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
One last quick question. I don't understand why one of Kevin Hurley's eyes is black and the other one is blue in color on the screen. Do you have, I haven't noticed that in person lately, Kevin, but it certainly, you look like one of those.
Cyborgs.
Yeah. So, don't know.
You remember Arnold's line in the Terminator, "I'll be back." Well, so that's a result of my second plane crash almost 20 years ago. So
Okay.
I wear it proudly.
Well, excellent presentation. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Kevin. And thank you to everyone who attended this evening. I think that it's really great for you guys to get on board through these webinars and present to the Sheep Center constituents. Board President Carolyn Gillette has a message. I'll read it for her. Carolyn says, "It is inspiring to be with so many people spread around the West who care about these sheep and how we might be able to be the best partners in stewards going forward." Completely agree. Couldn't have said it better, Carolyn. I will invite you all to our meeting on Saturday. We talked here about interaction between the environment and pathogens, also nutrition, leading to the manifestation of disease in sheep. So we have Kevin Monteith on our lineup for Saturday, who will speak about his research, which is that. So please join us this Saturday. You'll see the Zoom link in our email. And we'll be starting that annual meeting at 4 p.m. Mountain Standard Time this Saturday. So to be continued. Thank you very much for joining us.
Sarah, you want to mention you've got these in your bookstore, right?
I do.
And online? You guys.
Please send us it. We're working on our website. So please send us an email if you'd like to purchase it, and we can get that to you.
And I feel like we should say, Bob might say it before I did, but nobody makes any money off of this book. Nobody profited off of writing their chapters. None of the photographers all volunteered everything. So it was purely just a labor of love. So.
And thank you guys for doing that.
Quick shout out, thank all you folks for the presentations. The National Bighorn Sheep Center is going to continue these things, these webinars for the next, we don't know how long as they're successful. If you've got email lists of people that might be interested, send them to Sarah so Sarah can send them out and let people know about them. This is the second one or so. We're gaining a little bit in audience. I would like to see a lot more. I think there's a lot more interest than showed up tonight. Tonight was very successful, but that, and also, so two things, send it out to your friends. And the second one is topics. Sarah and her staff and the board, we're putting together topics for the future webinars for the next several years. This is one service we can provide to the nation in terms of outreach and education about ecology, management, and research on bighorn sheep. So thank you for helping.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.